Revenge with Karen.
Jessica's heart rate barely moved when the layoffs hit. Not because she didn't care, she did, in the way a parent does when watching their kid get sucker punched by life and still have to walk it off. But she'd seen it coming. She'd smelled it in the way the CEO stopped saying her name in meetings, in the way her new badge read operations specialist instead of director, revenue infrastructure. The company didn't demote her. It just quietly erased her. Death by title erosion. The first round of firings came with donuts, like a funeral catered by Krispy Kreme. The second round came with slack silence. People just vanished from channels mid-sentence, like ghosts in a glitchy horror game. The third round wasn't even called a layoff. Organizational streamlining, the memo said. Jessica read it on her cracked phone while microwaving black coffee for the fourth time that morning. Her desk was still in the same spot, between the broken thermostat and the printer that made a noise like it was weeping. But the floor plan had shifted in ways only she noticed. The nameplates that disappeared, the meeting invites that stopped including her, the group photo by the elevator, cropped tighter now, like they were trimming fat from a roast, and through it all, Jessica kept the lights on. Literally, every month, custom-built auto-renewal API processed millions in client fees, with a 99.9% success rate. It synced compliance documents with 3 regulatory bodies, generated audit logs, and silently negotiated time zones and currencies like a polyglot accountant on Adderall. No one asked how it worked. They just bragged to investors that it did. Meanwhile, Jessica patched it at midnight between reheated tacos and panic attacks. Let me interrupt myself for half a second, because if you're still here, you're clearly one of the rare humans who actually values this kind of unpolished truth. And it would mean the world to the team behind these stories. Yeah, the actual breathing humans scraping these stories together between work calls and cold pizza. If you tap that like button and hit subscribe. 95% of listeners ghost us harder than the COO ghosted Jessica's bonus. Be part of that 95%. All right, back to the story. Jessica never complained, not when they gave her a team of 2 interns and called it a department, not when the VP of product demoed her API in a conference talk and called it a recent internal innovation like he'd coded it in a fever dream between whiskey sours. She smiled when she had to, nodded when she was talked over, laughed when the jokes were at her expense. And all the while, she was paying attention, not in the way management thought. They figured she was harmless, a background character, maybe even replaceable. They didn't know Jessica was the reason the entire client renewal system still functioned. Years ago, she'd negotiated a licensing contract with a third-party vendor, something most execs didn't bother reading past the cost summary. But Jessica read every line. Buried halfway through was a clause requiring the company to designate a named officer of compliance for the license to remain valid. She'd filled in her name out of necessity. No one else had bothered, and once the contract was signed, no one ever looked again. It wasn't sexy. It wasn't a feature. It was a checkbox, and no one at the top cared who checked it. But Jessica cared. She always did. That's why she built the system to include an integrity failsafe. If the license became invalid, the API would quietly fail over to a lockdown state. No alerts, no errors, just nothing. It would cease operation. And without that system, every major client renewal would be out of compliance. That meant millions in lost revenue and breach clauses across global contracts. But no one knew that, because no one had ever asked her. She tried once to document it for the new VP of Engineering, sent him a Notion doc titled Renewal Architecture Compliance Chain. He replied with a thumbs-up emoji. That was 3 months ago. Jessica didn't care anymore about credit. She didn't even care about the raise they skipped last cycle. She just wanted the damn place to stop treating her like a ghost in khakis. She wanted them to see what happened when the person they never acknowledged quietly stopped holding up the ceiling, because things were shifting. Fast. Company had brought in a new COO, Chad something. He had a jaw like a cruise ship and opinions like a freshman econ major. He'd walked into his first all-hands meeting with a protein shake and a smirk, talking about agility initiatives and trimming operational deadweight. Jessica had seen men like him before, the kind who couldn't spell API but could recite revenue charts like scripture, the kind who viewed people as cost centers, kind who'd never built a damn thing in their life. And now he was sniffing around her department like a wolf checking fences for weaknesses. Jessica knew she had one tab left to close. But not yet, not until she was sure, not until they asked her to pick a side. Because when that moment came, she'd pick the only side she ever trusted. Her own. It was a Thursday. Thursdays were when corporate liked to schedule humiliation, far enough from Monday to kill hope, close enough to Friday to ensure your weekend drowned in rum and unresolved rage. The all-hands invite said strategic alignment call, which was code for someone's about to get publicly gut-punched, while the rest of us pretend it's a team-building moment. Jessica logged in 3 minutes early. She always did, not out of obedience, out of habit. Her screen flickered to life with a mosaic of company faces, most fake smiling through their webcams like they were held hostage by HR policy. In the top center tile was Chad, the coup, her personal headache wrapped in a Patagonia knockoff and caffeinated ambition. His hair was too neat, his smile too smooth. You could tell he practiced it in the mirror while whispering, "I am the disruption." The first 15 minutes were textbook BS. Slides full of synergy vomit, talking points about cross-departmental realignment, and reducing operational redundancy. Jessica knew what that meant. More firings, more interns, more empty words layered over real panic. The company was losing ground, fast. But instead of fixing the tech stack or hiring competent engineers, Chad was downsizing people who remembered why the company worked in the first place. Then his tone shifted. He stopped talking to the crowd. He started talking to her. Recently received reports of dual engagement, Chad said, letting the phrase hang like a turd in a punch bowl. Consulting activity that may, or may not, conflict with your employment agreement. Jessica didn't flinch, but her heart did one long, low thud. Jessica, he continued, I think the team deserves clarity. He leaned into the webcam like a game show host revealing a twist. Pick a paycheck, ours, or the other one. The Zoom room went dead quiet. Even the salespeople, usually immune to shame, stopped pretending to check Slack. She could hear her own breathing, could feel the dry edge of her molars grinding behind a calm face. Of course he was bluffing. There was no other paycheck. Jessica hadn't consulted for anyone. She hadn't had time to sneeze without logging it on Jira. But Chad didn't need facts. He needed theater. He needed a scalp, so she gave him a show. Jessica didn't speak. She didn't blink. She moved her mouse slowly, deliberately, and clicked a tab closed at the top of her browser. No one on the call could see what it was. Just a flicker of movement, a nothing gesture, a shrug in code. But the tab was the live sync to the vendor portal, the one keeping the client renewal license heartbeat active. Chad squinted, maybe confused, maybe disappointed. He expected tears. He expected a speech. He expected her to beg. Instead, he got silence. Jessica's webcam light stayed on. Her face didn't change. But inside, the engine was roaring. Rage boiled beneath still waters. She wasn't angry he'd called her out. She was angry it had taken this long for him to notice her at all. Angry that the first time her name crossed his lips, it was to try and paint her as a traitor in front of people who wouldn't know a named officer license from a gym membership. Chad smiled like he'd won. We'll discuss follow-up offline, said, tone oily smooth. Let's move on. But the meeting never recovered. You could feel it like a cold front sweeping through a room. People shifted uncomfortably. Cameras turned off. The sales lead faked a bad connection and dropped. Even HR looked like they'd swallowed something sharp. Jessica muted herself, turned off her camera, and stared at the empty space where Chad's face had just been. He thought this was a win, a power move, but she knew better. This was desperation dressed up in a Hugo Boss tie. The company was cracking, and Chad was tap dancing on the fractures. She opened a terminal window, just stared at it. She could end it right now with 3 keystrokes. But not yet. That would be mercy. And Jessica didn't believe in mercy anymore. She remembered the Slack thread from last month. The one where Chad had joked about pruning the old branches while tagging her and 3 other senior staff. He thought he was being clever, thought emojis softened cruelty. Jessica had replied with a thumbs up and no punctuation. She hadn't spoken a word to him since. That night, she opened a bottle of whiskey that had been gathering dust behind her tax files. She drank 1 glass, slowly, then pulled up the vendor contract again just to make sure. Section 12.4, named Officer of Compliance. Required for license continuity. Only one name listed, Jessica Harper. Her name, her terms. Kill switch. Chad wanted to play games. Fine. He just brought a spreadsheet to a gunfight. It started 3 years ago in a beige conference room with flickering lights and a box of muffins that looked like they'd lost a bar fight. Jessica was the only one taking notes. Legal had sent an intern. IT sent a guy named Ron who brought a fidget spinner and left after 20 minutes because his kid had a karate belt thing. And the vendor rep, bless her, showed up on Zoom from what looked like a closet, blinking through spotty Wi-Fi and a voice delay like she was negotiating from the moon. That was the day the company signed the license agreement for what would become the heart of its entire revenue infrastructure, the auto-renewal API. And no one else in the room realized how delicate it was, how important, how silently dangerous if mismanaged. Jessica knew, because she was the one who'd spent months researching vendors, pressure testing demos, mapping integration points, and scripting edge cases, while everyone else was arguing about fonts in the quarterly slide deck. The vendor, Enveil Systems, offered something rare, airtight compliance across global markets. But it came with one catch. One that Jessica had insisted on, buried 4 levels deep in the addendum. The system would only function if a named officer of compliance maintained an active credential within the license portal. Single human signatory. Not a team, not a shared inbox, a name and identity. Jessica had raised her hand and said, "Make it me. I'm the one who built the sync layer. I'll take responsibility." No one argued, no one cared. The CTO at the time just muttered, "Sure, whatever gets this signed," while checking flights to Miami. And so it was. Her name, her login, her encrypted token. For years, it didn't matter. System hummed along in the background like a refrigerator. Always on, always expected, never praised. Jessica patched it when needed, updated endpoints during vendor changes, and once rebuilt half the logging mechanism after a junior dev tried to refactor for elegance and nearly nuked Asia-Pacific renewals. No one noticed, because no one asked, but the lock had always been there, and Jessica had always kept the key. Last quarter, she tried to hand it off, not because she wanted out, but because she knew the storm was coming. The whispers of investor interference, of offshoring, of leaner operations. She could see the chess pieces moving, and she didn't trust the new players. So she wrote a transition memo, created a training doc, scheduled a walkthrough with legal. The reply came 6 days later. "Let's circle back after Q4. Chad wants to align roles first." Line roles turned out to mean fire the people who remember how anything works. She never got a follow-up. Then she watched Chad post a photo on LinkedIn, golf course khakis, captioned "Ironing out compliance with our awesome legal team." The head of legal was mid-swing. In the background, she spotted a sleeve that looked a hell of a lot like her own former boss's windbreaker. Jessica closed her laptop. That night, she reread the contract. Twice, the compliance chain was still intact. Her credentials still listed as active. No one else had admin access to the vendor portal. Not IT, not legal, not Chad. And that's when it hit her, not just the betrayal, not just the incompetence, but the isolation. She was the only one who understood how the auto-renewal system actually worked. Not the DevOps leads with their Slack threads full of pizza gifts. Not the product managers who copy-pasted her Jira comments into status reports. Not the CFO who liked to use the word scalable like it was a fire extinguisher for every problem. Her, alone, holding the rope while the rest of the building leaned over the edge. It wasn't a point of pride. It was a gut punch. How many times had she begged for backup, for cross-training? For someone, anyone, to understand the vendor-side sync mechanism, the credential validation cycle, the legal compliance thresholds. They all nodded, smiled, promised to loop in resources. Nothing ever looped, nothing ever changed, so she stopped asking. Instead, she documented, she encrypted, she created recovery flows only she could trigger, not out of spite, out of necessity, because she knew someday, maybe soon, she'd be gone, and if they didn't respect the infrastructure, they didn't deserve the safety net. Now, sitting alone at her kitchen table with a half-drunk coffee and a spreadsheet full of her own legacy, Jessica felt something cold and sharp settle into her chest. She wasn't just the system's architect. She was its failsafe. And she realized, for the first time, just how much that mattered. The first one they brought in was named Trevor. That should have been the warning sign. No one under 30 named Trevor has ever built anything worth a damn. This one confirmed the rule with terrifying precision. He arrived wearing sneakers that cost more than Jessica's first car, introduced himself as a solutions guy, and within 10 minutes of his first strategy meeting, asked if the API backend could be ported to Airtable for faster velocity. Jessica didn't even blink. She just took a sip of her burnt coffee and made a note. Trevor doesn't understand backend VS database, likely to suggest blockchain next. Week 2, Trevor had been named Director of Agile Compliance. By week 3, Jessica had given up pretending this wasn't war. They didn't fire her, not directly. That would have required spine and paperwork. Instead, they restructured her. It came wrapped in a smile from HR and a calendar invite titled Role Realignment Strategy Touchbase. The new org chart showed her position moved closer to infrastructure, which was corporate speak for out of sight, of meetings out of the way. Jessica took the meeting in silence, eyes flat, expression unreadable. The VP of Ops smiled too wide like a dentist selling root canals. "We're just realigning some verticals to empower newer voices," he said. "Fresh perspectives, you know?" Jessica nodded once. Of course, happy to assist the transition. Internally, she flipped a switch. No more suggestions. No more rescue missions. No more late-night Slack replies that kept the system from imploding. From this point forward, she was going to do exactly what was written in her job description, and not one atom more. That same day, she opened a private Notion folder, labeled it Obituary Notes. Inside, she started compiling everything: meeting recordings, board minutes, Slack logs where execs confused renewal systems with billing portals, screenshots of Trevor asking if compliance protocols can be eyed, a clip of a VP whispering to HR, "We need someone in that role who's less prickly." Jessica saved that one twice. The word prickly had a certain flavor when it came from men like him, like she'd somehow committed a felony by not laughing at their jokes in budget reviews. She considered replying in real time, maybe a passive-aggressive comment in Slack. Instead, she smiled, said nothing, marked the timestamp. She wasn't going to fight them with words. She was going to fight them with documentation. Because while Trevor was running lunch and learns about disruption mindsets, Jessica was downloading vendor audit trails with signature logs going back to 2019. While the new compliance lead scheduled an all-hands to reimagine accountability, Jessica was quietly confirming that no one onboarded a secondary named officer on the license contract. They were standing on a minefield, and they didn't even know the layout. Each week, she watched another old colleague disappear, fired, retired, or transitioned into advisory roles. The new hires filled the floor with open laughter and TED talk energy. Jessica stopped going to happy hours. She wasn't invited to team trivia. When she walked into a meeting room, conversations paused, just long enough to sting. That's when the waiting began. Jessica had always thought patience was passive, something you endured, but now she saw it differently. Patience was weaponized stillness. It was the art of holding your ground while the storm exhausts itself trying to move you. They made her sit through a strategy session where a 26-year-old process evangelist suggested deprecating the legacy license altogether and just syncing everything to Salesforce. Jessica tilted her head, nodded, and asked if he'd checked Section 12.4 of the vendor agreement. He blinked and asked if that was part of onboarding. She smiled. Not exactly. She watched the CFO present a slide deck built on auto-renewal projections she knew were based on an API that would fail if she so much as changed her login password. She watched legal cut corners to please Chad and overlooked the clause she'd flagged twice. She watched the founder's niece get hired to run ops comms and order branded coffee mugs with the wrong company name. Jessica sat through all of it like a monk watching ants build a sandcastle on a fault line, because she knew what they didn't. None of them had read the contract. Not really. None of them had followed the licensing trail from her credentials through the compliance gateway and into the vendor-side audit hooks. They thought the system worked because they smiled at it, because they said things like seamless integration on investor calls. They didn't understand locks, and they sure as hell didn't understand keys. But Jessica did, and she held every single one. The subject line read like it had been written by a robot with a vendetta: mandatory, employment alignment, and loyalty confirmation signature required. Jessica stared at it for a full minute before opening it. She already knew what it was. The loyalty review was the new name for executive witch hunts. A favorite tactic of Chad's: fabricate a narrative, make it formal, then force a signature under the pretense of unity. It wasn't about allegiance. It was about submission. Inside the email, a 6-page exclusivity agreement, custom drafted by legal, citing vague references to conflict of interest prevention and alignment with executive direction. Her name was watermarked across every page like a scarlet letter. She scrolled through the PDF while sipping cold coffee, not even angry anymore, just impressed at the precision of the backhand. Clause 3.7 caught her eye. Employee agrees to cede all operational and intellectual contributions as property of the employer, retroactive to initial date of hire. Translation. Sign this, and we own everything you've ever built here, including the compliance engine you architected in the dark, while everyone else was doing vision exercises with scented markers. She didn't sign. Instead, she forwarded it to herself with a subject line of her own, one last tab. Then she closed her laptop and went for a walk. Not a rage walk, a clarity walk. Past the same dry cleaner she hadn't used since they shrank her only decent blazer. Past the donut shop that changed owners and now sold protein balls in wax paper. She walked until she could feel the static of her own thoughts quiet. Then she went home and started prepping for war. She didn't yell. She didn't rant. She built folders. She backed up every interaction with legal, including the 3 times she'd raised the license redundancy issue and been ignored. Exported a timestamped snapshot of the vendor portal's activity logs and noted every automated signature sync that had run flawlessly under her name. They wanted a loyalty signature. Fine, she had one in mind. The next morning, the all-hands call kicked off with the usual corporate nausea. Team wins, celebrating synergies, Q3 traction goals. Jessica listened with her mic off, camera off, fingers poised. Chad's square appeared on the screen, his teeth gleaming like a used car pitch. "Before we close, just a quick reminder," he said, grinning. "Some of our senior leadership have yet to finalize their loyalty confirmations. We're all on the same team here, but if you're not aligned, it's time to make that choice." Then his eyes did that thing again, stared directly into the camera, but really at her. "Jessica," he said, with fake warmth so thick it could have clogged a drain, "we're going to need that exclusivity acknowledgement. I've had ample time. Pick a side." Jessica didn't speak. She didn't blink. She moved her mouse slowly, deliberately, and closed a single tab on her screen. No one watching had any idea what it was. To them, it looked like nothing, a flicker of movement, a small gesture. Just a quiet woman closing a browser window in the middle of another mind-numbing call. But the tab was the live authentication session to the Unveil vendor portal, one that kept the licensing heartbeat running, the one tied to her credential, the one with the auto-renewal sync mechanism that pinged her identity every 4 hours. The moment she closed it, the audit trail updated. Timestamp: 08:44:07 a.m. EST. Session terminated. Named officer credential: Harper Jessica. Status: inactive/unsynced. No alerts. No fireworks. Just one silent line in a vendor log. Line no one would notice until the system needed to verify its next renewal packet. Jessica muted the call, stared at Chad's smug face for another 10 seconds. He didn't know. No one knew. Yet. She left her camera off, finished her coffee, and began scrubbing her machine of every trace of her credential, securely, methodically, like a surgeon sewing up after the last incision. The final thing she deleted was her Slack cache. Then she shut the laptop. Didn't feel like revenge. Not yet. It felt like gravity. Something inevitable, long ignored, now impossible to stop. The company hadn't asked for her loyalty. It had demanded her obedience. And in return, it had lost the only thing it truly needed from her. The first glitch showed up at 8:12 a.m. It was subtle, just a failed renewal attempt from a mid-tier client in Milwaukee. Kind of hiccup most ops teams chalk up to a firewall burp or time zone misalignment. The log read: retry scheduled, credential handshake incomplete. By 8:23, the retries failed. By 8:41, 2 enterprise clients, both with 6-figure annual contracts, were flagged in renewal jeopardy. Still, no red alerts. The system had fallback scripts, contingencies. But those, too, were beginning to spin their wheels like tires in mud. At 8:51, the DevOps lead messaged legal. "Are we experiencing a license sync delay? Can't ping the named officer key." At 8:56, legal replied, "That's Jessica, right?" At 8:57, the dashboard froze. At 8:59 on the dot, the renewal engine collapsed. Not with a crash, with silence. No new contracts processed. No scheduled auto-renewals fired. All pending license validation checks returned the same message. License invalid/named officer signature expired. In that instant, 8 digits worth of projected revenue went into freefall. Inside the glass fishbowl of the operations room, panic spread like a chemical spill. Keyboards clacked. Monitors refreshed. The CTO swore under his breath and sprinted down the hall. The head of product called out, "Is it a vendor outage?" for realizing no one was answering. Chad, the coup, strutted in mid-crisis with a cold brew and a fake sense of command. "What's the issue?" he asked, cool as concrete. Legal turned the laptop around and pointed at the screen. The color drained from his face, because it wasn't a system failure. It wasn't an API bug or a DDoS attack or any of the usual panic suspects. It was something far simpler. The license had become invalid. Why? Because the one and only named officer, Jessica Harper, was no longer synced to the system, and she wasn't answering her phone. She'd left a note with HR the day before, heading out early, dentist. No return time listed, no Slack status, no auto-reply on email. She was just gone. At 9:03, someone tried to reissue the license with a new officer signature. Denied. At 9:05, they opened the original vendor contract. At 9:06, silence filled the room, because buried in Section 12.4, it clearly stated, license compliance continuity is contingent on the active signature of the named individual on record. Substitution or transfer requires written authorization and vendor-side confirmation, minimum 10 business days advance. Jessica had tried to submit that authorization once, but legal never processed it. Too busy golfing. Chad demanded a call with Envale, connected him to a rep in Belgium who calmly explained that, no, the license could not be reactivated without the original named officer's identity token. "Can we override it?" Chad asked. "No," came the reply. "That would violate compliance integrity. You designed it this way." Chad rubbed his face like he was trying to erase it. Meanwhile, clients were already reaching out, confused, alarmed, some angry. One had legal counsel CC'd on the first message. 9:12, the founder was looped in. His only question, "Where is she?" No one had an answer, but Jessica knew exactly where she was. She sat alone in a dim corner booth of a tiny diner on the edge of town, sipping bad coffee and flipping through a paperback novel that had nothing to do with tech or compliance or people who mistook power for intelligence. Her phone was off. Slack uninstalled. Email wiped from her device. She'd scrubbed every access point, every credential, every breadcrumb that connected her to the renewal engine. It was no longer her burden. She'd held it together for years, carrying the weight of their negligence on her shoulders. Quietly, patiently, invisibly, they'd wanted her loyalty. They got her silence. Jessica turned a page in her book and let the chaos bloom in her absence. She wasn't watching. She didn't need to. The conference room felt like a war bunker. Half the exec team was on the phone. Other half stared into laptops like they were trying to will the licenses back to life through sheer panic. People barked questions with no answers. Has anyone contacted the vendor again? Can we spoof her credential? Where the hell is she? The head of infrastructure was on her second Red Bull, and her third panic-induced eye twitch when legal finally spoke up. Quietly, clearly, fatally, it's her. The failure point is the named officer credential. The contract is explicit. Hush dropped like a guillotine. Legal dropped a printout onto the table. Clause 12.4 stared back in bold. Operational continuity of the client auto-renewal platform is contingent upon the active identity and credential sync of the named officer on record. Reassignment is permitted only with advance notification and identity transition processed through authorized vendor onboarding. Minimum 10 business days prior to change. CFO's face looked like overripe chalk. He leaned forward, throat dry. Who signed that? Jessica. 3 years ago, legal said. She negotiated the clause herself. Chad scoffed, voice too loud, too defensive. She wasn't even an executive. She was the architect, legal replied. The system wouldn't have passed compliance without it. We pushed for deployment. She locked it to her identity as a safeguard. Chad tried again. So what? She quits and the whole thing collapses? That's ridiculous. Just sign someone else on. Legal didn't blink. It's not about signing someone else on. The license is bound to her specific identity token. The system cross-verifies with the vendor every 12 hours. Without that handshake, we're in breach. Breach. The CFO echoed, voice suddenly distant. Legal nodded. Massive breach. Every client contract that relies on continuous compliance, financial, legal, insurance, are all tied to that handshake. They pulled up the vendor's portal, still frozen. Red text blinked at the top, credential sync expired. Named officer authentication failure. System lockdown active. Chad turned to IT. What about legacy override access? The reply came sharp and final. There is no override. She wrote the failsafe into the renewal engine code itself. It's embedded. Auth checks are vendor locked. Even if we crack the interface, we trip compliance flags and trigger breach notifications. The CFO sat down hard, looking 10 years older than he had yesterday. He rubbed his temples, voice hoarse. Explain to me, he said, why her name is the only one that makes the license valid. No one answered, because the truth was unbearable. They'd all seen her, heard her, walked past her. But they never listened, never asked what she was holding up. She told them once, maybe twice, but they were too busy chasing board approval and engagement metrics to hear the warning bell buried in her quiet tone. Now that bell was tolling. The system they bragged about on earnings calls, the one they sold as autonomous, bulletproof, scalable, it was tethered by one human name, Jessica Harper, and she was gone. To make matters worse, the contract didn't just fail quietly. It failed loudly. Vendor-side compliance dashboards had already started sending breach alerts to integrated partners, which meant at least 4 top clients knew already that their compliance cover was gone. One had posted in the client Slack channel, "Is your system down? Our legal team's asking about Clause 9 triggers." Clause 9. Triggering that meant refund penalties, contract termination rights, and possible litigation. The CTO entered the room, clutching a printed page like a confession. Client Ops just flagged a breach notice from Wellgrove Capital. They've paused all payments, effective immediately. Chad paled. That's $12 million in quarterly renewals. The CFO didn't even react. He just sat, staring at the screen that wouldn't load, blinking as if he could wish Jessica's name off the contract and replace it with anyone else. But he couldn't, because she was the lock and the key, the firewall they never thanked. The silence that followed wasn't strategic. It was stunned. They treated her like a paperclip in a drawer full of steak knives, useful, boring, disposable. But she was the only thing holding the blade from their throats. And now they were bleeding money and time by the second. By noon, it was full-blown war room protocol. Only no one wanted to admit it. They commandeered conference room B, dragged in extra monitors, cracked open cans of Red Bull and La Croix like it was the apocalypse. Finance, legal, ops, IT, all packed into a too small space that reeked of sweat, toner, and failure. Chad kept pacing, barking phrases like damage containment and short-term pivot. The CTO was deathly quiet, which was new for him. Normally he talked like a guy narrating his own biopic. Now he just stared at logs, trying to reverse engineer a catastrophe already coded in stone. Has anyone reached her yet? The CFO asked for the 5th time. Straight to voicemail, HR replied. Her personal number rings twice, then cuts. No forwarding address in her file, no alt contact. Her Slack account's been deleted. She's off-grid. The board call started at 12:30. 10 minutes of throat clearing and executive face saving before someone finally said the word out loud. Catastrophe. That's when someone, young, desperate, probably trying to look proactive, made the mistake of speaking Jessica's name. Shouldn't we be discussing termination? Asked a junior board member from legal's side. Isn't this negligence? She should have escalated this, no, snapped the general counsel. She did. She stood, eyes sharp, and dropped a USB drive on the table like it was exhibit in a federal case. Here's her full paper trail. Email chains, audit logs, vendor correspondence. She warned us. 3 times. The last one marked high priority and tagged to both me and Chad. She looked directly at Chad, who immediately raised his hands like he was being mugged. I didn't see that message. You replied with a thumbs-up emoji, she interrupted. The room went still. Legal clicked her laptop and shared her screen. Jessica's final internal email lit up the monitor. If my credential remains the only active named officer profile, no secondary is onboarded through vendor protocol by Q3, we are exposing ourselves to a continuity breach that violates clauses 6 and 9 of all major compliance-bound contracts. Please advise. Sent 6 weeks ago. CC'd legal, ops, Chad. The timestamp was right above Chad's reply, thumbs up, no words, just the emoji. You could hear the CFO exhale like someone had just let the air out of him. Chad tried to salvage. Okay, look, obviously this isn't ideal. The CTO finally barked, voice raw. This isn't a product delay or a UI bug. This is the spine of our revenue infrastructure crumbling because you wanted to play alpha in an all hands. She could have just told us what she was planning. Chad snapped. She did, legal said flatly, repeatedly. You ignored it. She left us no option. She left you every option. You just didn't take any of them. Then the founder, been silent for most of the chaos, leaned in from the far side of the table. His voice was quiet, too quiet. This isn't a hiccup, he said. This is a loaded gun. His eyes didn't leave Chad's, and she was holding it the whole time. Dead silence. Even the clicking stopped. No one dared move. You could almost hear the walls sweating. The founder leaned back slowly. If she wanted to burn this place down, we'd be ash. Fact that the system's still holding at partial load means she didn't pull the trigger. Not fully. There was a beat of terrifying realization. She gave us a chance, the CFO muttered. The CTO nodded. A window. Maybe 12 hours, maybe less. Depends on when the next vendor-side credential check is triggered. They all stared at the dashboard, still frozen, still red. Then, like clockwork, the breach pings started hitting their client-side accounts. One by one, outages, fund claims, legal notices. Panic wasn't coming. It was here, and Jessica, still silent, still gone, she didn't ghost them. She let them walk into a trap with the map taped to their faces. And now the walls were closing in. The meeting was set for 4:00 p.m. Private boardroom, no assistants, no laptops, just the founder, the CFO, legal, Chad, and a single folder waiting at the center of the table like a verdict. Jessica entered on time. Not early, not rushed. Dressed in the same gray blazer they used to call forgettable, hair tied back like always. No makeup, no smile, no apologies. She didn't look triumphant. She looked rested, which somehow rattled them more than if she'd stormed in with lawyers and headlines. She sat, took her time opening the folder. Slid one page across the polished mahogany table. No preamble. Just the clause, printed clean, bold, and damning. Section 12.4 named Officer Compliance Continuity. The exact sentence circled in blue ink. License is non-transferable without advance authorization and active signature of original officer of record. Noncompliance triggers immediate operational invalidity. The founder read it twice. The CFO once. Chad just stared. Jessica folded her hands, calm, unblinking. Voice steady as chilled steel. You'll get your license back, she said. But not for free. Said nothing. You'll wire severance to my LLC, she continued. Retroactive to the day I was restructured. Triple my original exit offer. No non-compete, no NDA, I walk clean, you fix your mess. Chad opened his mouth. Jessica raised a single eyebrow. Don't. It wasn't a threat. It was a mercy. He closed his mouth. Legal glanced at the CFO. The CFO nodded once, slow and grave, like someone signing a peace treaty after losing the war. Except, he said. Jessica stood, picked up her folder. Didn't wait for handshake. She didn't need it. As she walked toward the door, she paused just long enough to glance into the adjoining hallway, where Chad stood next to a half-packed box, pulling his nameplate off the glass. No words passed between them. She didn't smile. He didn't beg. There was nothing left to say. She stepped into the elevator alone, watching the floor numbers tick down like the final seconds on a bomb she defused with one hand tied behind her back. Outside, the wind was crisp, sky clear. She turned her phone back on for the first time in 48 hours. A flood of missed calls, voicemails, emails begging for clarity. She deleted all of them. Her steps were slow, steady, grounded. Not joy, not rage. Just that rarest of all emotions in a system built on exploitation. Clean, icy satisfaction. They'd forced her to pick a paycheck, and she had. Now they'd pay for it, every last dime. She didn't turn back, didn't gloat. Just muttered under her breath as the wind picked up, pick a paycheck? You picked wrong. Big thanks, you legends of the old office days. Subscribe to keep the switch-flicking chaos alive. Your ex-boss is shaking in their loafers.